My name is Teresa Langley, and I am 63 years old. I have always believed that family is made visible in the small things: a handwritten card in the mail, a child's drawing magnetized to a fridge, a phone call just to ask what's for dinner. I used to think love could be measured in presence, in showing up even when it's inconvenient. So when I got the call from Alana, my daughter-in-law, just 2 weeks before Christmas, I knew before she even said the words that I was being quietly erased. She used the kind of tone reserved for corporate firings, smooth and vague and overly sweet. She said they were keeping Christmas intimate this year. Just the three of them. A reset, she called it. Too much going on, she said. Not personal, just simplified. I smiled through the phone and said I understood, but something in me folded in half like a letter that would never be sent. Nathan was quiet in the background. I could hear him breathing. He never picked up the line, never added a word. And that silence said more than if he had screamed. I had bought gifts already. A small tea set Ava had admired at the market. A book I knew Nathan loved in college, a rare edition I found second-hand. For Alana, a silk scarf in her favourite deep plum. I placed them in a box anyway, wrapped each one with care, and tied the lid shut with a thin gold ribbon. Then I carried it to the storage closet and placed it on the highest shelf beside the dusty wreath I had once made from cinnamon sticks and pine cones. On Christmas Eve, I made myself lamb stew. I lit a candle. I watched an old movie I used to share with Nathan when he was a boy, one where the snow always falls at the perfect moment. And still, I checked my phone twice an hour. Not because I expected a change of heart, but because hope is a stubborn, foolish thing. The photos arrived the next morning. Alana, in a cashmere sweater, holding a mimosa. Nathan in flannel, smiling like he belonged to someone else now. Ava with her arms stretched wide in front of a mountain of gifts. They had a private chef, personalized cookies, matching pajamas. I clicked through the album once, then closed the app and turned my phone face down. The kettle whistled. Outside, the street was quiet. A single robin perched on the fence, watching me through the window like it knew. I took a deep breath, let it fill every hollow part of me, and exhaled slowly. If they wanted simplicity, they would have it. But not just for Christmas. I had been quiet too long. I had been useful, invisible, convenient. But I had not been irrelevant. And the difference between those things was about to matter. Maybe not now, but soon. January was coming, and I would be ready. The silence on Christmas Eve was not heavy or loud. It was sharp, like the crack of thin ice under a slow-moving foot. The kind that does not break all at once, but groans in warning. I had placed one small stocking by the window, a tradition I kept even when no one else remembered it. It was faded red, the threads thinning at the seams. Stitched decades ago with Nathan's name in clumsy gold lettering I had once thought was beautiful. I sat in the same armchair I used to read in when he was small, the upholstery worn down on the left side from years of my leaning toward him. The tree was modest. Just a tabletop one with battery-powered lights and a single box underneath containing a pair of socks and a journal I had bought myself. Outside, the snow fell without sound, soft and slow, layering the street like ash after a long burning fire. I made a pot of chamomile tea, the same kind Ava liked, and poured it into a chipped porcelain mug with tiny violets painted along the rim. When I opened my phone, I did it gently, as though preparing to handle something fragile, and the images arrived before I had the strength to look away. Alana, flawless as always, in a silk robe the colour of bone, holding a crystal flute of champagne beside a white and gold Christmas tree that looked plucked from a showroom. Nathan sat on the floor beside her, grinning too wide, like a man trying to prove something, one arm around Ava, who looked taller than I remembered. She wore a matching robe, monogrammed, and held a small designer bag in her lap like it meant something more than time or presence. My chest ached in that slow, suffocating way that grief often does, not because I wasn't there, but because I was so thoroughly replaced. There was no room in the photos for the woman who had once hand-sewn felt ornaments with Ava. No place for the grandmother who had taught her to braid hair and tie ribbon around cookies. I scrolled until my eyes blurred, and then placed the phone on the windowsill beside the stocking. I did not cry. I did not speak. I did not let the anger win. Instead, I stood, walked to the bookshelf, and pulled down a folder labeled Langley Accounts in my careful handwriting. It smelled faintly of dust and peppermint oil. I laid it on the table like a map, opened the first page, and began reading. I had been the invisible architect behind their success for years. I had balanced their ledgers, filed their taxes, and taught Nathan how to write a business plan when he thought an LLC was just another acronym. They had taken what they needed and pretended I was never part of it. But numbers do not forget, and neither do I. It was the day after Christmas when I opened the filing cabinet, not because I was looking for anything in particular, but because I needed to feel like I still held some part of my life in order. The flat was too quiet. The kettle had already boiled and cooled twice without being poured, and my hands needed something more than idle grief to keep them from shaking. I ran my fingers across the labels, most faded with age, and stopped at the one marked Langley and Company. 2016. 2021. I had always kept meticulous records, a habit I never lost from my days managing small business accounts at the firm. Nathan used to call me his second CFO, half joking when he was starting out. Back then, he came to me not just for money, but for guidance, for spreadsheets and formulas, and late-night reassurance over mugs of tea. He had fire, but no structure, and I had seen too many men like him burn through their own potential without someone steadying the flame. I pulled out the folder and laid it open on the table, smoothing out pages with the same care I once reserved for bedtime stories and holiday recipes. The first sheet was a simple balance statement from their second year, highlighted in my hand, circled notes where I had questioned line items that didn't match receipts. I flipped through slowly, pausing on every odd entry I had once dismissed as harmless optimism. Back then, I thought it was my job to give Nathan space to lead without making him feel like I was still parenting him. But now, with the cold glow of hindsight, I saw what I hadn't dared to admit. Alana's name appeared frequently on the company expense list, tied to meals and travel and boutique purchases listed under vague justifications. I found one line in particular, £4,000 for a weekend retreat in the Cotswolds, charged during a quarter where their payroll was late. Another for $500 in floral arrangements for a client meeting that never took place. The patterns began to take shape like bruises under the surface of skin, blooming slowly but unmistakably. I opened a fresh notebook and began to catalogue each irregularity, my pen moving with calm precision. Numbers do not lie. They do not soften their edges or wear perfume to disguise themselves. They tell the truth when people forget how to. I made tea, this time drinking it before it cooled, and read until the streetlights flickered on. Somewhere between the fourth and fifth ledger, I felt something settle inside me, not rage, but resolve. They had written me out of the story because I made the beginning of it too easy. But now that the cracks were showing, the very foundation they stood on had my fingerprints in its mortar. I did not raise a fool. I raised a man who forgot where he came from. And now I would remind him. Gently. Thoroughly. Quietly. George answered on the second ring, his voice as dry and clipped as ever, though there was a trace of surprise beneath the formal greeting when I asked if he was still in town. We hadn't spoken in over a year, not since the funeral of a mutual friend. And even then we had exchanged more nods than words. But when I mentioned I wanted to ask about something tax-shaped, he chuckled low in his throat and said, "My kettle is always on." I took the bus to his flat the next afternoon, carrying a tin of shortbread biscuits and the folder that had grown heavier by the hour. George lived in a narrow brick terrace just past the park, surrounded by overgrown roses and a wind chime that clattered like glass bones in the winter wind. His living room smelled faintly of pipe, tobacco, and old ink, and he poured my tea with the same methodical hand he used to sign affidavits. I explained everything without drama, laying out each document like evidence on a courtroom table. George listened, his bushy white eyebrows inching higher with every highlighted receipt and circled discrepancy. He didn't interrupt, didn't scoff or smirk, just took the pages one by one and read in silence, his teacup growing cold beside him. When I finally stopped talking, he leaned back, exhaled slowly, and said, "This company was never structured to succeed. It was built to siphon." I had suspected as much, but hearing it aloud gave shape to the quiet dread I had been carrying like a stone in my coat pocket. George tapped his finger on the incorporation document I had helped Nathan file 6 years ago. "Your name's not on this, but your fingerprints are all over it. You gave them the blueprint. They just turned it into scaffolding for something shaky." We worked through the afternoon, updating spreadsheets, checking ledgers, referencing old government filings I had forgotten I even kept backups of. George, despite his retirement, still had access to more databases than most firms and a memory like a vault door. By sunset, we had 3 manila envelopes full of annotated reports and 1 preliminary report ready to hand to any investigator, financial journalist, or divorce attorney in London. Not that I planned to release them just yet. I had no interest in burning the house down, only in making sure the people inside remembered who laid the foundation. George patted my hand as I stood to leave and said something that stayed with me all the way home. "You don't have to shout to be powerful, Teresa. You just have to know where the paper trail ends." I walked back through the cold with that line tucked in my chest like a flame in a lantern. I had once been the quiet accountant in the background, the one who reconciled the numbers while others made speeches. But now I had numbers that whispered something louder than any words they could speak. And I was listening. It was tucked away in the 4th drawer of my old oak desk, the one I rarely opened anymore except to retrieve birthday stamps or emergency batteries. The original draft of the LLC agreement, printed on ivory paper and carefully annotated in my own neat script, sat inside a folder I had labelled in fading blue ink. I hadn't meant to find it that day. I was only looking for a charger cord that had gone missing. But perhaps fate has a way of placing the right pages in front of you, when your heart is steady enough to read them with clarity. I had helped Nathan and Alana write the agreement in their 2nd year of business, back when they were still uncertain about tax classifications and licensing fees, and came to me with every little question as if I were the oracle of their success. I had insisted on including a section about fiduciary oversight, a boring but essential clause designed to protect the business, in case one partner failed to act in its best interest. Nathan had laughed at the time, saying they'd never need it. Alana, always a little more guarded, had smiled and nodded, but made no effort to read it closely. And now here it was in my hands again, Clause 14b. In the event that either managing partner is unable or unwilling to act in accordance with the fiduciary responsibilities outlined in Section 7, temporary financial oversight may be granted to the original filing consultant, should that person have verifiable evidence of mismanagement or suspected fraud. The words hit me like a bell rung in an empty church. I had written that clause myself, almost as a reflex, not to gain power, but to keep the doors from falling off if things ever turned reckless. I never imagined I'd use it, never dreamed they would treat me like a relic to be discarded. Never thought I'd be the one holding the final pin that could unravel everything they had built on vanity and borrowed money. I read it 3 times, then closed my eyes and let the weight of it settle in my chest. This was not revenge. This was responsibility. And in a world where they had mistaken my silence for surrender, the law still remembered the part I played. I made a copy of the page, tucked it gently into my notebook with the other receipts and ledgers, and added a tab with the words leverage written in careful block letters. That night, as the wind pressed against the windows and the street below filled with blinking holiday lights no longer meant for me, I poured myself a glass of port and sat in the quiet with the kind of power that does not rush or shout or beg to be seen. It waits. It prepares. And when the time is right, it moves like ink across parchment, slow but permanent. The printer whirred softly in the corner of my kitchen, its rhythmic hum almost musical against the silence of my flat. Page after page slid out onto the tray, each one a quiet indictment dressed in colour and clarity. There was Alana's carefully curated Christmas brunch, complete with a private chef flown in from Brighton. Her name tagged proudly in the corner of the image, as if applause could be downloaded. There was Nathan holding up a pair of leather boots that cost more than my monthly pension, his smile wide, his shirt new, the tag from a designer brand still visible in the mirror's reflection behind him. And there, nestled under a tree too grand to fit in any memory I had of their modest living room, sat Ava, clutching a Dior purse that would make a tax auditor blink. All of it charged through Langley and Company. I knew the business account's name because I had helped them open it. I knew the card numbers because I had helped set their spending caps. But those caps had long been ignored, and now, with each printout, I was quietly building a case neither of them could argue with. I wasn't planning to expose them with dramatic flair. There would be no angry phone call, no online tirade, no confrontation in a lawyer's office. That was not my way. My power did not sit in volume or threats. It lived in margins and signatures and expense categories flagged in yellow highlighter. I labelled each folder by month. Stapled receipts I pulled from publicly posted photos and matched them to known account activity, even double-checked timestamps. The precision was calming, like restoring order to a cupboard after a long season of chaos. They had made a show of their holiday, wrapped it in white and gold, and polished it with filters. But underneath the glitter was a paper trail, and I was tracing it with a surgeon's hand. Each time I found another post, another careless boast, I felt the resolve inside me sharpen. They had asked me not to come for Christmas, and I had obeyed. But now their extravagance would speak louder than any invitation could have. I was not preparing for war. I was preparing for clarity. And when the moment came to act, I would not raise my voice. I would simply submit the documents, place them on the right desk, and let the facts speak in a language even arrogance could not talk over. The frost hadn't melted from the pavement when it began. A Monday morning in early January, quiet and blue around the edges, the kind of day that smells of leftover tinsel and broken resolutions. I was making tea when the first call came through, Nathan's name lighting up my phone like a flare in still water. I didn't answer. I let it ring until the screen dimmed, then slid the phone face down beside the kettle. Minutes later, another call, this time from Alana. Then a message. "Mum, are you up? Something's wrong with the business account." I sipped my tea in silence, the steam curling into my glasses. They were right. Something was very wrong. Because by the time they realized the account was frozen, the bank had already flagged 3 months of irregular transactions and unusual vendor activity. I had submitted the documents 3 days earlier, folded into a neat envelope with a signed cover letter citing Clause 14B of the original LLC agreement. The language had been careful, not accusatory, just alert. I did not call it fraud. I simply asked whether personal expenses exceeding £30,000 over a 2-month period were within the intended scope of Langley & Co.'s mission statement. It was enough. Enough to trigger a compliance review. Enough to pause the outflow. Enough to lock every card tied to that account until someone in a suit reviewed the files. By mid-morning, I imagined the boutique scene. Alana at the till, clutching a dress worth more than my monthly rent, her smile tight, her tone clipped as the assistant tried again. Declined. Perhaps, she whispered, tried a second card. Perhaps Nathan stood beside her, checking his phone with a crease in his brow. I pictured it not with malice, but with a strange calm, like watching dominoes fall in a room you had quietly exited. I did not gloat. I did not celebrate. I simply sat at my kitchen table, the one still dressed in a red runner from my own quiet Christmas, and watched the sun crawl across the linoleum. This was not revenge. This was accountability. The kind that moves through systems rather than shouts in hallways. I had always taught Nathan to read the fine print, to know where the safety valves were, to respect what paperwork could hold. He had forgotten. And now, without warning, the paper had spoken. The letter was signed in black ink and stamped with the kind of authority that makes people sit up straighter, even if they don't know why. I walked it to the post myself, wrapped in a blue folder, with copies of every page clipped in the right order. The motion was clear. I was not accusing. I was requesting. A formal independent audit, on the basis of financial irregularities and potential misuse of company funds. It was the kind of language that does not raise eyebrows until it's too late. By the time Nathan and Alana received the notice, their accountant had already rung them twice. George, bless him, was kind enough to warn me that the accountant was rattled. Said she had tried to distance herself from the whole thing, claimed she was never made aware of certain purchases or reimbursements, and when asked to defend the statements she had signed, she simply quit. No press release. No damage control. Just a quiet resignation email, followed by a forwarding address. The resignation hit them first, then the letter, then the bounced lease payment. Langley & Co.'s office was a sleek glass space on the 3rd floor of a shared executive suite near the city centre. All open windows and coffee bar aesthetics, the kind of place that costs more in monthly rent than I spent on groceries for half a year. The landlord had always been lenient, but not this time. Not with a flagged account and a payment that never cleared. I heard from someone, a former client of theirs, that Nathan had tried to stall with a phone call. Said the audit was a formality, that the funds would clear soon. But delay is a language landlords rarely speak, and by the following Thursday, they received a formal warning. I watched it all unfold from the quiet of my flat, where the radiator clicked and hissed like it always had, and my expenses were handwritten in a notebook that never lied to me. I did not feel triumphant. I felt resolute, as if I were finally holding the wheel of a ship that had drifted too long into indulgence and self-deceit. They had asked me not to come for Christmas, made it clear that I no longer belonged in the family circle. So I stepped outside the circle and looked at the lines they had drawn. And now, the lines were red. Not of my making, but of their own hand. I chose the cafe carefully. One of those quiet places near the park with chipped teapots and warm wood tables that don't pretend to be more than they are. The kind of place where truth doesn't echo, only settles. I wore my soft blue coat, the one Nathan had once bought me for Mother's Day when he still remembered things like that. He arrived 15 minutes late, shoulders stiff, eyes already burning with a quiet fury he tried to disguise as frustration. He didn't order anything, just sat down and folded his arms like he had shown up to an ambush. I didn't raise my voice or flinch. I simply reached into my bag and placed the folder on the table between us. Not like a weapon, but like a reminder. The original LLC documents I had drafted, signed, and notarized when he and Alana were barely out of their honeymoon phase. Receipts. Expense reports. A highlighted clause he had clearly forgotten. The one that gave me temporary control if mismanagement or abuse of funds could be reasonably demonstrated. His jaw tightened. He didn't touch the folder, didn't even glance at the numbers. Just muttered that this wasn't how family handled things. I stirred my tea and met his gaze. Not with anger, but something softer and far more dangerous. Clarity. I told him I had raised him better than this, that I had taught him what stewardship meant, that the business I helped build was not supposed to become a piggy bank for Christmas chefs and designer luggage. I told him gently that I had watched from the sidelines while they turned their ambition into excess, and that while I had once believed in stepping back for the sake of peace, I now understood that silence had only enabled them to forget their own roots. He said I had blindsided him, that I should have warned him. I smiled, slowly, and said I had, years ago. Every time I taught him how to balance a checkbook, every time I reminded him to log his receipts, every time I said, people notice patterns, not apologies. I didn't lecture. I didn't threaten. I just let the facts sit there, quiet and undeniable, like footprints in wet cement. When he finally stood to leave, he left the folder on the table. I picked it up, smoothed the cover, and watched him walk away like a man who had just realized the map he ignored was the one that could have saved him. We stood in the narrow hallway outside his office, where the light from the window hit the floor in a long, tired stripe, and the walls still held the framed blueprint of the first shopfront he opened, the one I helped him afford before Alana ever entered the picture. I hadn't come for a scene. I hadn't come to argue. I had come to say what needed saying before the silence between us hardened into something that could never be chipped away. I held no folder this time, no ledger or affidavit. Just my voice, steady and old and full of the weight of things I should have said long ago. I told him I remembered signing the loan paperwork that kept his business alive after its first rough quarter. I remembered staying up with him sorting receipts at the dining room table when he barely knew what quarterly taxes meant. I reminded him that Alana came into a running engine and took credit for the ignition. I reminded him, without anger, that her smiles had edges and her dismissiveness came wrapped in clean napkins and cold charm. I told him that Christmas was not about turkey or lights or posted photos. It was about the people you gather when the world feels dark. And when the world turned cold for me, they shut the door. She shut it with manners and phrases like, just immediate family this year. And he let her. He let her speak for him. He let her reshape the space where I used to be welcome. I said it calmly, but I watched the words land like small stones dropped into a frozen lake, each one cracking the surface just a little more. He leaned against the wall and said nothing, not a single word. His face folded in on itself, not with rage but with something quieter and harder to watch. Shame, maybe recognition, I don't know. I didn't need an apology. I didn't come for redemption. I came to say the truth before it turned to poison in my chest. I looked him in the eye and told him I had nothing left to prove. No appetite for war, just a ledger full of facts and a memory full of the nights. I had soothed his fevered forehead while Alana now erased me like a scratch on her perfect floor plan. He stayed silent, and in that silence, I found closure. Not a door slammed, one quietly shut behind me. It was a friend from church who left the newspaper on my porch, folded neatly with a yellow sticky note that simply said, "Page 14. I brought it inside with the rest of the mail, expecting coupons or maybe a gardening tip, but when I flipped to that page, the headline sat there like a quiet gavel. From buzz to bust, a startup's glittering rise and sudden fall. It wasn't front-page news, and that suited me just fine. It was nestled in the business section, halfway down the sheet, where the real stories hide behind press releases and glossy PR masks. The article traced the arc of Nathan and Alana's company with a kind of journalistic grace that felt both respectful and unflinching. They had once been the darling duo of the local tech scene, praised for their modern branding and polished pitches. But now, just beneath the surface, cracks had spidered through their facade. There were whispers of poor bookkeeping, a frozen account, a high-profile client pulling out without notice. And then, buried in the fourth paragraph, was the sentence that made my breath catch. Sources close to the matter cite a silent co-founder who, after identifying irregularities, initiated a formal audit that triggered a chain of events leading to the company's current financial review. No name, no photo, just truth, like a fingerprint left on a frosted window. I read the sentence again and again, not out of vanity, but because it felt like something had been quietly corrected in the universe. Not revenge, not even recognition, just balance. Someone had seen the real spine beneath the polished surface, had acknowledged that the structure had once been built with steadier hands. I folded the page and placed it in the drawer with the other records, not to gloat but to remember. A relic of a moment when silence spoke louder than outrage, and quiet action rippled further than threats. Alana would see it, eventually. Her name was quoted once, brushing off the audit as a clerical misunderstanding. But even ink cannot save a sinking ship when the hull has been hollowed by carelessness. I made myself a cup of tea and watched the steam rise from the mug like memory. There would be no headline about me, no apology in print. Just a quiet sentence on a quiet page in a town that now understood what I had known all along. That I was never just the woman who once watched the books. I was the one who built the ledger. It was a grainy photograph, taken from across the street and uploaded without fanfare to a local gossip page that usually covered things like boutique openings and school fundraisers. But there she was, Alana, in oversized sunglasses and a sleek beige trench coat, carrying 2 cardboard boxes down the steps of the townhouse they had once bragged about during brunches and interviews. The caption read only, "Looks like a move," but I didn't need words to explain it. The shutters on the windows were drawn. The driveway half full of disassembled furniture legs and lampshades poking out from more boxes. The kind you buy in bulk from office supply chains when you're not hiring movers, but still want to look like you're in control. Nathan was nowhere in sight. Not behind her, not carrying anything, not even visible through the windows. Silence, it turns out, can be photographed. And this image caught it perfectly. Social media went from curated posts about work-life balance and inspirational leadership to nothing at all. No photos of flat whites on marble counters. No blurred images of their daughters' ballet shoes on hardwood floors. Just absence. So loud it echoed through every gap they once filled with curated noise. The company's website still existed, but the contact page was blank. Emails bounced back. A single-line note was added 2 days later, saying operations were paused for restructuring, though anyone who had ever seen a closure dressed up in clean language knew what it meant. It wasn't victory that settled in me when I saw that photo. It wasn't gloating either. It was something much deeper, quieter. Like setting down a stone you've carried so long you forgot it wasn't part of your spine. I poured myself a glass of water. Not wine, not celebration, just water, and stood at the window with the photograph printed out and folded once in my hand. I didn't post it. I didn't share it. I simply saw it and let it exist. Sometimes the end of something doesn't need to be shouted from rooftops. Sometimes it just looks like someone in designer sunglasses lifting a box she once thought she'd never have to pack. Sometimes justice arrives not with fireworks, but with tape on cardboard, and the click of a door closing behind the one who thought she'd never leave. It was a grey Saturday morning in late February. The kind where clouds hang low like unspoken words, and the chill nudges through the windows, no matter how tightly they're latched. I was kneading scone dough in my small kitchen, fingers dusted with flour, and the radio humming something soft in the background, when I heard the knock. Not the postman, not a neighbour, just a gentle, almost unsure rhythm against the door. I opened it to find Ava standing there, bundled in a coat too thin for the weather, her curls pulled into a loose bun, eyes uncertain but familiar. "Hi, Grandma," she said, voice quiet but steady, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. I stepped aside, and she walked in like she had done 100 times before. Only this time, there was no suitcase, no mother hovering, no plan, just her. I offered her tea, but she asked for scones, the way she used to when she was little and we'd bake on Sunday afternoons. So we did. I added extra currants, and she stirred the glaze while I watched her hands. Grown now, more graceful but still bearing that childhood gentleness that had not been entirely erased. We didn't talk about the company. We didn't talk about Alana, or headlines, or bank accounts. We talked about her school, about how she was learning to cook on her own, about the book she was reading and how she still remembered the bedtime stories I used to read her. She asked if I still had the old copy of Charlotte's Web, and I showed her the worn spine on my shelf, taped once down the middle from where she'd dropped it in the sink years ago. We sat on the couch. After the scones had cooled, 2 cups of tea between us. No camera, no curated smiles. Just us. It wasn't a holiday. It wasn't anything Instagram-worthy. It was better. There was no need to perform kindness, no need to pretend affection. She came not because it was expected, but because she wanted to. That mattered more than any gift I had ever wrapped. That afternoon, as snow began to fall faintly against the window, I realized something had shifted. I didn't need to be written into anyone's plans to matter. I didn't need to force belonging. Love, when it is real, walks in on its own and sits down beside you without asking for permission. And that was the only holiday I needed. It was tucked between 2 recipe clippings and a grocery receipt I never used. The envelope cream-coloured and slightly bent at the corner, like it had leaned too long against things that didn't care if it stayed pristine. I had forgotten about it. The way you forget to take something out of the freezer until it's too late for dinner. A Christmas card I had written in the first week of December, before the phone call, before the polite disinvitation that landed like a slap covered in lace. I remembered sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of cinnamon tea, using the nice pen I reserved for holiday notes, trying to make my cursive look cheerful, even though the ache in my chest told me I was already being left out. The message was simple, full of warmth I had rehearsed. How proud I was of their accomplishments. How I hoped the holiday brought joy. How I couldn't wait to see Ava's face light up when she opened her presents. I had even slipped in a little note about the scones I planned to bring, with clotted cream and her favourite raspberry jam. But I never sent it. After Alana's message arrived, trimmed with civility but hard as granite underneath, I tucked the card away. Not out of spite, but out of clarity. There's a moment when you realise the gesture will not be received in the spirit it was intended, that sending it would not reopen warmth, but instead remind them of the very door they closed. So I left it sealed, unsigned. Finding it again didn't bring tears. It didn't unravel me the way old letters sometimes do in movies. It just made me pause, the way a forgotten melody will make you stop in the middle of a task because your memory recognizes the tune even if you don't remember the lyrics. I turned the card over in my hands. Its surface still smooth. Its weight still meaningful, even after everything. I opened my drawer, the one where I keep scissors and tape and stamps that probably no longer stick, and I placed the envelope gently beside them. Not to revisit, not to cling, but to acknowledge that some things belong to a version of yourself who still hoped for something different. I didn't need to send it anymore. I had already said what mattered in the way I chose to live after. Quiet, steady, and without apology. The sun came in soft that morning, not in a hurry the way summer light barges through the window, but gentle, like it was asking permission to touch the table. I sat with a warm cup of tea between my hands, no alarm clock blaring, no buzzing phone, no mental list of who needed what from me before I'd even taken my first sip, just quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't ache. For the first time in years, January did not arrive like a season I had to brace for. It came like a gift I had forgotten to unwrap, all calm and stillness, with the faintest clink of the spoon in my mug and the birds arguing over something outside the window. The kitchen smelled of toast and citrus, and I realized I hadn't thought once about what Nathan or Alana were doing. Not because I didn't care, but because I no longer felt tethered to their silence. I had not ruined them. I had simply stepped aside and let gravity take care of the rest. There is a difference between destruction and removal, between spite and surrender. I did not claw at their walls. I stopped holding them up. And the moment I let go, everything they had built on shaky foundations began to shift. That was never my intention. But now that the dust had settled, I could see clearly that my absence had said what years of loyalty never could. At the center of it all had always been me, holding receipts, soothing tension, watching my own joy shrink so others could feel comfortable. Not anymore. Now, the tulips I placed in the chipped blue vase opened in their own time. The radio hummed a tune I did not rush to change, and my tea cooled at its own pace without a single person asking me to reheat it for them first. Ava's laughter still lingered in the hallway from her visit the day before. And on the table sat the half-finished crossword. She had insisted we complete together. I did not feel forgotten. I felt free. The kind of freedom that does not come with fireworks or declarations, but with a chair pulled out for no one but yourself and a life arranged without apology. January, once cold and full of obligation, now felt like mine. Not a punishment, not a consequence, just mine. And I welcomed it with both hands open.